The Great Gatsby sold fewer copies in its first year than a mediocre cookbook. The man who wrote it died broke, forgotten, and convinced he had wasted his talent. He never once believed he had written a masterpiece. Here's the strange part. Every flaw in Gatsby's life, every illusion he built, every person he couldn't quite see clearly was a flaw Fitzgerald was living through at the exact same time he was writing it. This isn't a story about a book inspired by a life. It's a story about a man who couldn't tell where his life ended and the book began. Most people meet The Great Gatsby in a classroom. A teacher calls it a story about the American dream, and that's true, but it's also the smallest possible version of what the book actually is. Here's the real claim this novel makes, the one nobody hands you in high school. Gatsby is not a man undone by ambition. He's a man undone by his own narration of himself, by the story he told so often that he stopped being able to tell it from the truth. And the unsettling part is this. Fitzgerald wrote that story while doing exactly the same thing to himself, in real time, sentence by sentence. To understand the book, you have to walk through it the way he wrote it, not afterward looking back, but moment by moment, as his life and his manuscript shaped each other. So let's go back to where both of them started. In 1920, 23-year-old Fitzgerald published This Side of Paradise. It made him famous in a matter of weeks, the kind of fame that arrives before a person has figured out who they actually are. That same year, he married Zelda Sayre. She had refused him once already, telling him plainly that she wouldn't marry a man without money. So Fitzgerald had done something very close to what Gatsby would later do in the novel. He turned himself into the kind of man she would say yes to. Different income, different visibility, same person underneath, rebuilt for an audience of one. By 1922, the couple was living in New York at a pace that consumed money faster than Fitzgerald could produce it, even with magazine fees that made him one of the highest-paid short story writers in America. Zelda's spending was constant. Their parties were constant. Underneath the glamour, Fitzgerald was already a man performing solvency he didn't have. This is the exact emotional material he would hand to Gatsby 3 years later, a man whose entire visible life is a performance aimed at being worthy of one person's approval. But what nobody around Fitzgerald understood yet was that he was about to do something with this feeling that went far beyond living it. He was about to start writing it down. In the summer of 1923, Fitzgerald began the first draft of what would become The Great Gatsby. This early version was longer, more cluttered, and far more directly autobiographical, closer to a confession than a novel. In this draft, Gatsby existed, but he was thin, a sketch instead of a person. Readers later would say the same thing Fitzgerald himself feared, that they could not understand why anyone would care about this man enough to die for him. Notice what's happening here. At the exact moment Fitzgerald could not yet make Gatsby into a fully realized person on the page, he was also failing in his own life to be fully honest about who he was becoming. He was hiding his drinking from people who asked. He was hiding the depth of his debts from Zelda. He was a man who understood, intuitively, the mechanics of constructing an appealing surface because he was doing it himself every day while struggling to do it convincingly for a fictional man on paper. This is the first hint of the thesis. The book wasn't reflecting his life from a distance. It was failing and succeeding at the same rate his life was. But the moment that changed everything hadn't happened yet. It happened the following year in France. In the spring of 1924, the Fitzgeralds moved to the French Riviera, partly to escape their expenses in New York, partly because Fitzgerald needed distance to finish the book seriously. It was there that he made the decision that turned Gatsby from a flawed manuscript into one of the most carefully engineered novels in American literature. He rebuilt the entire story around a narrator who was not Gatsby himself. Nick Carraway, cautious, morally uncertain, simultaneously drawn to and disgusted by the world he's describing, became the lens through which the reader sees everything. This wasn't a small technical choice. It meant the reader would never get direct access to Gatsby's interior life. Every glamorous, tragic detail would arrive secondhand, filtered through someone who admits openly that he is an unreliable judge of the people around him. Here is where the comparative becomes unavoidable. Fitzgerald, that same year, was living as his own version of Nick Carraway, the half-participant, half-observer of his own marriage. He could see what was happening to Zelda, to their finances, to the version of himself he had built in 1920 to be worthy of her. He could narrate it with painful clarity. He just couldn't stop it or step outside of it. The decision to filter Gatsby through Nick wasn't simply a stylistic flourish. It was Fitzgerald handing the reader the exact psychological position he occupied in his own life, close enough to see everything, powerless to change any of it. It's worth pausing on something here. Fitzgerald never said in any letter or notebook that he consciously designed Nick to mirror his own position. Some of his closest readers believe this alignment was intuitive, something he arrived at because it was the only way the story felt true, not because he sat down and planned a self-portrait. The control he had over his sentences was total. The control he had over what those sentences revealed about him was not. And it was in that same year, revising obsessively, that Fitzgerald made the choice that would define the entire emotional center of the book. By late 1924, Fitzgerald was deep in revisions, and one image kept reappearing across draft after draft: a green light, visible from Gatsby's lawn at the end of Daisy's dock. On its surface, it's a small detail. In the architecture of the novel, it becomes the entire emotional engine. The green light is not Daisy, it's the idea of Daisy, the proof, if Gatsby can ever reach it, that everything he built was worth building. This is the moment the thesis fully crystallizes. Gatsby doesn't love a woman, he loves what reaching her would mean about the man he turned himself into. The green light is unreachable by design, because what it represents, total vindication, total proof that the reinvention worked, was something that a person could never actually deliver. Fitzgerald was writing this in the same months he was watching his own reinvention fail to deliver what he'd expected. Fame hadn't made him secure. Money hadn't made Zelda happy or stable. The version of himself he had built in 1920 to be worthy of her had not in fact solved anything underneath. He could not say this directly about his own marriage, not in a letter, not to Zelda, possibly not even fully to himself. But he could give it to a man named Gatsby, reaching towards a light across the water, and let the reader understand what Fitzgerald himself was only beginning to understand. He sent the finished manuscript to Maxwell Perkins in October 1924. Then he had to wait to find out if any of it had worked. The Great Gatsby was published on April 10, 1925. In its first year, it sold around 20,000 copies, fewer than its debut novel 5 years earlier had sold in the same window. The reviews split. Some critics recognized something extraordinary. Others called it a beautifully written but minor book about people not worth the attention. Hemingway told Fitzgerald privately that it was remarkable, then spent years afterwards implying in various indirect ways that Fitzgerald had already written his best work and had nowhere left to go. Fitzgerald believed both of these things at once, and that's the detail that matters most. He had just finished writing the most precise diagnosis of his own self-mythology that he would ever produce, and he walked away from its publication convinced he had failed. This is the final, sharpest comparative in the entire story. Gatsby dies still believing the green light is reachable. He never gets the clarity the reader gets watching from Nick's distance. Fitzgerald, finishing the book, was in almost the same position. He had written the clearest possible argument for why his own life's project was an illusion, and he still went back to chasing it, back to the magazine money, back to the parties, back to trying to write something that would prove definitively that he was as good as people once said he was. He spent the next 15 years trying to write a novel as good as Gatsby. He never finished one. Tender is the Night took 9 years and never matched it. The Last Tycoon was still on his desk, unfinished, the night he died in December 1940 at 44 years old, owing his own editor money. He died believing the book was minor. But what he could never have predicted was what would resurrect it. In 1942, the U.S. government's Armed Services Editions program needed short, durable paperbacks to send to soldiers overseas in fourth foxholes and field hospitals across the Pacific and Europe. He had been dead for 2 years. He never knew. Here's the version of this book most people walk away with from school. A rich man throws parties, loves a woman he can't have, and dies for it. A warning about money and ambition. Here's what the line of his life and the line of his manuscript actually show you, side by side. The Great Gatsby is a study of a man who couldn't separate his real self from the self he performed, written by a man who, in the exact same years, was discovering he couldn't do that either. The green light isn't about wealth, it's about the impossible hope that reinvention can be proven once and for all by reaching the right person. Gatsby never gets to find out it can't. Fitzgerald did, and kept reaching anyway. Today, the novel sells roughly 500,000 copies a year. That's more in 12 months than it sold across Fitzgerald's entire lifetime. The book he died believing was minor is now the most assigned novel in American education. He asked Perkins near the end if anyone still remembered it. He never got to see the real answer. Fitzgerald spent his life chasing proof that his reinvention of himself had worked. He wrote the clearest warning ever published about exactly that chase, and never once recognized it as a warning meant for him.
The green light is different for everyone, but the mechanism is always the same. We build a version of ourselves, aim it at something just out of reach, and call that reaching a life. If you want to keep reading between the lines, the next story is already waiting.